The most dynamic duo in all of Verina that bounces around like a pogo stick in battle is finally here in the second half of version 2.0, and Roccia and Pero are bringing a lot to the table for those looking to wreak havoc on the battlefield. As a Havoc, heavy attack damage focused sub DPS with an easy to use and easy to understand kit that combines fantastic buffing with fantastic grouping, she's a great pick for players looking to get top performance out of other Havoc focused main damage dealers like Camellya and Rover, helping them reach their full damage potential. With that, welcome to our full scope, comprehensive guide to Roccia, our newest addition to the roster that's coming equipped with her own best in slot Sonata set. And I'm here to break down everything when it comes to how she works, what her best equipment will be, and the steps you need to take across her team building and rotations to make the most out of her insane buffing potential. As always, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Roccia, with her baseline kit, centers around the use of her normal attacks and resonance skill to lift herself up into the air and repeatedly slam down on enemies, all while providing fantastic grouping in AoE situations with incredible uptime. Her forte circuit is where it all begins, a simple meter that builds up to 3 stacks of imagination generated in a variety of different ways. These stacks are used to trigger that oh-so-famous voice line, Mamma Mia, and her following consecutive ground slams. The first way she generates stacks is with her basic attacks. This is a simple 4-hit attack chain that gradually accumulates stacks, with 1 stack generated after the first 3 attacks and the second generated after the 4th. The second method is through her heavy attack, which can be charged up for several seconds to grant between 1 and 3 stacks depending on the length. Her third method is through her intro skill, which generates a full stack upon use, and the fourth is through her resonance skill, which will generate 1 stack and summon a tornado that displaces and groups nearby enemies. When Roccia's forte circuit has at least 1 stack, using her heavy attack or resonance skill will send her into the air and activate the Beyond Imagination state, allowing her to attack and slam into the ground up to 3 times, based off of her imaginary stacks before entering the state. These attacks gradually increase in both damage and concerto energy generation, so to have the smoothest rotations possible, it's highly recommended to build up 3 full stacks before entering her enhanced state so that all 3 slams can be used. They all deal heavy attack damage and are a majority of her damage across most of her rotations. Roccia's Resonance Liberation, on the other hand, is a very simple ability that deals heavy attack damage in an AoE around a target and grants an attack buff to the entire team based off how much critical rate she has, over 50%. To maximize this bonus, you'll want her at 70% critical rate or above to apply a 200 attack buff. This can be tricky for a lot of players looking to maximize her damage potential. When factoring in all of Roccia's abilities and their interactions with each other, she has a simple playstyle that focuses on generating 2 out of her 3 forte circuit stacks through an intro skill and basic attacks before casting her resonance skill to group enemies, enter her enhanced state, and generate her third forte stack. She'll then slam into the ground 3 consecutive times, dealing massive AoE damage while rapidly generating her concerto energy, and then cap off her rotation by casting a Resonance Liberation before swapping onto her main DPS to continue the team's rotation. She offers a lot of utility and a simple to use playstyle that keeps her out of harm's way through abuse of the Z-axis, making her similar in playstyle to a sub DPS like Jeja, who has similar evasive capabilities built into her kit. She is, without a doubt, one of the easiest characters to use on the roster. She also comes equipped with one of the most powerful outro skills in the game, which grants the incoming Resonator at 20% Havoc and 25% basic attack damage amplification for 14 seconds or until the character leaves the field, heavily boosting the output of characters like Camellya and Havoc Rover. When it comes to her inherent skills, her first grants a 20% attack buff whenever she uses her heavy attack or resonance skill, and her second grants the recipient of her outro skill a special gadget called the Magic Box that is used via the utility button. This gadget pulls in nearby enemies and deals a small amount of Havoc damage and has a usable duration of 14 seconds, which lines up perfectly with her outro buff. Roccia is a character with almost no complication at all, but a variety of different methods to build up her forte circuit and in turn her Mamma Mias, with an insane amount of grouping and buffing potential that can make a lot of teams and main DPS characters much easier to play. The only catch is that she needs a lot of investment across her echoes to reach her full damage potential and ER requirements across her rotation. When it comes to actually building Roccia, starting off with her skills, you'll want to prioritize her forte circuit as it's the main source of her personal damage across her rotations. Next up will be her Resonance Liberation, as it's another big source of her damage. Third will be her Resonance skill, as it's used in all of her rotations to group enemies and generate her third imagination stack. And last up will be her basic attacks, as you don't need to use them very often at all if you're playing Roccia as a sub DPS. As with most characters, you can keep her intro skill at level 5 or lower to save resources like your weekly boss mats, as the small increase in scaling isn't really worth the resources. Moving forward with her weapons, Roccia doesn't really have many synergistic options and is one of the hardest characters to build in the game. These are what the overall comparisons are looking like using being Abyss Surges, the standard 5-star gauntlet, as a baseline. Credits to Pridewin. Let's explain these results, starting off with her signature, Tragic Comedy. This weapon is tailor-made for Roccia, with a respectable 24.3% crit rate, a 12% attack buff, and a massive 48% heavy attack buff whenever a basic attack is used. And all of Roccia's Mamma Mia's slams count as a basic attack that deals heavy attack damage. This means she'll keep constant uptime on the buff across the most damaging parts of her rotation, and simply needs a basic attack a single time to apply this buff to her Resonance Liberation, which also deals heavy attack damage. The next best option is another 5-star limited weapon, only this time it's Zhongli Yao's. With a 12% attribute damage buff and an identical crit stat to her signature, Verity's Handle is a great overall stat stick that makes meeting Roccia's 70% critical rate requirement much easier for her Liberation's full buff. However, she deals literally no Resonance Liberation damage at all, making its secondary effect non-existent in her kit. Her third best option is the standard 5-star gauntlet. With a lot of attack, energy regen, and a small buff to her resonance skill and basic attack damage, it's a solid option that lowers her ER requirements and her echoes, but with its lack of critical rate, it can be very difficult to maximize her Liberation's buffs while using this weapon. When it comes to 4-star options, her best option will be Stoneard, simply due to the fact that it has a critical rate main stat that makes reaching her full buffs much easier. While it falls behind in damage relative to other options due to its buff to Resonance Liberation damage, which she doesn't use, this ease in the substat grind will make gearing Roccia much easier relative to its other options. When it comes to other 4-star options, there aren't very many. Celestial Spiral, the Blackshore's 4-star, can help loosen ER requirements, especially with more ranks, and has a high base attack that makes percentage buffs like Roccia's first inherent skill much more effective. Legend of the Drunken Hero, the Renacida Craftable, is another potential pick, but it can be difficult to stack up its effect in her teams. Hollow Mirage is a simple attack stat stick that should be a last resort. I don't recommend building this weapon at all, and you should save materials for a better option. Every other 4-star gauntlet isn't particularly helpful for Roccia, unless you're severely lacking in ER, as she builds up plenty of concerto in her baseline rotations. Now it's time to move on to her echoes, and Mamma Mia, this character is quite difficult to gear. Roccia has two main options to choose from as a sub DPS, Moonlit Clouds and the new Midnight Veil set released in version 2.0. The choice between these two sets is simple. If your Roccia is highly invested with a great weapon and substats, you'll want to run Midnight Veil to maximize her personal damage through its 2-piece Havoc buff and 5-piece nuke on outro skill at the cost of her buffing ability. However, she'll still apply a 15% Havoc damage buff to the incoming Resonator. On the other hand, if your Roccia is lacking in substats and doesn't have the best weapons equipped, Moonlit Clouds is a solid choice, sacrificing her personal damage potential to increase her buffing ability via the set's 22.5% attack buff to the incoming character combined with the Impermanent Terran's 12% damage boost. The biggest hurdle when it comes to gearing Roccia is the fact that you'll want 70% critical rate to maximize her team's buffs across her Liberation, and she has no critical rate upgrades at all on her skill tree, only critical damage. What this means is that if you don't have a critical rate weapon equipped, you'll need an average of 8.6% crit rate on all of her echoes, combined with a 22% critical rate from a maxed out forecast to maximize her buffs. That's not achievable for most players. However, the buff from her Resonance Liberation scales linearly with crit rate over 50%, so you won't lose out drastically from having less than 70%. You can also pair her with a character like Shorekeeper, who has a built-in 12.5% crit rate buff to dramatically reduce her requirements. Some might find this pairing mandatory. What this means is that for her Echo substats, you'll typically want a crit rate 4 cost, 2 Havoc damage 3 costs, and 2 attack 1 costs for optimal performance on both sets. If your Roccia is highly invested with her signature or Zhongli Yao's, you can sub in a critical damage 4 cost as long as you're willing to roll around 8.14% crit rate average on all of her echoes. That's a little tough. This means for her Echo substats, which will be identical across both sets, you'll want to prioritize critical rate a lot, damage, ER, heavy attack damage, and attack, aiming for around 2000 attack, 70% critical rate, over 260% damage, and 120 to 130% ER for smooth uptime on her Liberation, as it's mandatory on all of her rotations. Basic attack and resonant skill damage rolls are the only other usable ones across her kit, but don't go searching for these. Roccia also has the option of playing a main DPS role on teams with the Havoc Eclipse set and a buffer like Mortifi, but this isn't really recommended as both characters have much better options, like Roccia with Camellya or Mortifi with Jian. The last area of investment when it comes to Roccia involves your wallets and a lot of saved Astrite, and both might be running low on funds if you pulled Carlotta or Jinxie. Her sequence nodes. Big thanks to Pridewin for calculating her damage increase per node. Her first node is an insane quality of life buff for her rotation, causing her resonant skill to generate another stack of her Forte circuit and 10 more Concerto energy, while also granting her interruption resistance during her Mamma Mias. This dramatically decreases her rotation time, increasing her overall DPS, but doesn't actually provide a damage boost. Her second node grants a stacking Havoc 10% buff to the entire team whenever she Mamma Mias, capping up to 30% after 3 slams. When at full stacks, this increases by an additional 10% for 40% total. This buff is huge in her best-in-slot teams with Camellya or Havoc Rover. On the other hand, her third node grants her a 10% crit rate and 30% critical damage buff upon using her intro skill, greatly easing the substat requirement on her echoes to maximize her buffs while also increasing her personal damage. Her fourth node grants a massive 60% damage multiplier to her Mamma Mias for 12 seconds after casting her resonance skill. Her fifth node increases the damage multiplier on her liberation by a small 20% and her heavy attacks multiplier by 80%, giving her much more potential as a main DPS. Her sixth and final node is the big one. After casting her resonance liberation, Roccia gains a special buff that causes her ground slams to ignore 60% of an enemy's defense and also allows her to repeatedly cast her ground slams after her third, with each additional slam dealing the same damage as the third. This fully unlocks her main DPS potential, but requires her resonance liberation to be cast at the beginning of her rotation to fully utilize its effects. It also only lasts 12 seconds. Now that we've covered Roccia's build, let's get into some of her teams and optimal rotations. Her best-in-slot lineups feature Camellya and Havoc Rover as the main DPS, with Shorekeeper or Verina as her supports. Her fantastic buffs to Havoc and basic attack damage synergize very well with both characters, and her built-in grouping makes handling AoE encounters a breeze as both main DPSs have no inherent grouping abilities. When playing Roccia with Shorekeeper, you'll simply build up Concerto on Shorekeeper using her skill, basic attacks, and heavy attack forte while making sure to swap to Roccia at some point to land 3 basic attacks and build up 1 stack of her Forte circuit. Then you'll swap back to Shorekeeper to top off her Concerto to full with her Resonance Liberation to maximize the duration of her Stellar Realm, and then intro to Roccia, building up another stack of Imagination before immediately casting her Resonance skill to build up her third stack and enter the Beyond Imagination state. From there, you'll then Mamma Mia 3 times before activating her Resonance Liberation, and then her Echo skill before swapping onto Camellya or Havoc Rover to begin their rotation. You can decide when you want to activate your magic box across their rotation to further group enemies. On the other hand, when playing Roccia with Verina, you'll want to start off your team's rotation by basic attacking 3 times with Roccia to build up her first Forte stack before normal swapping to Verina to advance her basic attack chain, repeating attacks until she builds up a Forte charge. Then you'll skill, Resonance Liberation, and then jump into the air and attack until she fills up her Concerto, before using the Fallacy of No Return Echo skill and introing onto Roccia to then activate her Resonance skill, and then Mamma Mia 3 times. You'll then use her Resonance Liberation, Echo skill, and then swap to Camellya or Havoc Rover. For a more advanced rotation on Camellya, called Double Intro, you'll begin your rotation identically using Shorekeeper or Verina, but instead of attacking only 3 times to build up 1 Imagination stack, you'll attack 4 times to build up 2. You'll then intro onto Camellya with your support's full Concerto, attacking and building up her Crimson Buds until she reaches 10 full stacks. When Camellya is close to 85 or 90% Concerto and has 10 buds, you'll then swap back to Roccia, who will have 2 Forte stacks, and then Resonance skill, Mamma Mia 3 times, and then cast her Resonance Liberation and Echo skill before introing onto Camellya to cast her Liberation and then Ephemeral, before proceeding with the rest of Camellya's rotation. The only tricky part about Roccia's rotation is making sure you're using Roccia's abilities as fast as possible when she's paired with Shorekeeper, as the 30-second duration of her Stellar Realm at S0 can oftentimes time out when paired with a DPS like Camellya if you take too long with Roccia's inputs. Now that we've covered Roccia's team rotations, it's time to talk about Roccia's, and thankfully, she's incredibly easy to use. Roccia's baseline rotation should involve her building up her first Forte stack before she intros onto the field so that she can immediately use her Resonance skill after her intro skill instead of spending time basic attacking with the valuable buffs of Echo skills like the Fallacy of No Return or Shorekeeper's Stellar Realm active. This will let her activate her Forte circuit via her Mamma Mias as fast as possible and maximize the duration of these buffs before capping off her rotation with a Resonance Liberation. However, there's a small issue with this ordering. Since Roccia's Liberation grants its 200 attack buff only after it's cast, Roccia herself won't gain its benefits on her Mamma Mia slams, which are the most damaging part of her kit. You can enable this synergy by simply casting her Resonance Liberation immediately after she enters the field via intro skill. If you have her signature, you can basic attack a single time before casting this ability to grant its heavy attack buff for the hit. You'll then have this 200 attack buff active for Roccia's Resonance skill and then 3 ground slams, capping off her rotation with an Echo skill before swapping onto the main DPS. In this situation, however, you won't have the 20% attack buff from her first inherent skill active on your Resonance Liberation cast, so there's a trade-off in damage somewhere across your kit regardless of which rotation you use. I choose the one you're most comfortable with. For the fastest rotations possible, you can also go ahead and simply intro into Roccia without building up a Forte charge at all. You'll be able to follow up on this intro skill with a basic attack 4 and immediately generate another imagination stack. You can then follow up by using a resident skill and then the rest of her rotation. Do keep in mind that this will increase Roccia's rotation time compared to priming up that Forte charge in advance, and could be a problem potentially if you're pairing her with characters like Camellya and Shorekeeper, because Camellya wants as much uptime on those buffs as possible. But it's still not a huge time loss at all to do this, considering the attack does come out pretty fast. So keep that in mind as another potential rotation option that's also a lot easier to use and actually execute. At the end of the day, Roccia is one of the most versatile sub-DPS characters in the game that supports a premium and free-to-play option in Camellya and Havoc Rover that provides some much-needed quality of life through grouping for both of their kits, but comes with some pretty severe weaknesses across her very high investment requirement, extended rotation time, and lack of synergy between some of the buffs in her kit. She also has the incredibly large downside of having a very viable 4-star alternative in Sanhua, who at S6 can provide very similar buffing potential with much lower field time and investment requirements. Still, she has the unmatched benefit of being one of the best overworld characters in the game that makes activities like farming and map exploration an absolute breeze due to the plentiful spawns of enemies and her grouping. She also is one of the easiest characters to use on the battlefield and has some interesting viability as a main DPS at higher sequence nodes. However, it is important to keep in mind that she is a sub DPS for most players and won't be able to carry teams on her own, but every player will own a copy of Havoc Rover, giving her instant viability on any roster. It is unfortunate that she isn't a premium option for more characters, so her use cases are somewhat limited. So let your love of a character like the MC or Camellya decide whether or not she's worth the pull. But do keep in mind that an S6 Sanhua is still a very competitive and in some cases better alternative for players. As always, if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace out.